The ice in my glass was the only thing working at the company New Year's party. It rattled against the cheap plastic as I stood near the refreshment table, watching the condensation slick my palm. Victor Lane was across the room, his face flushed a deep, expensive shade of red that matched his Italian silk tie. He was holding court near the decorative tree, his voice booming over the forced festive music and the hollow chatter of 75 people who would rather be anywhere else. I had spent 12 years at Miller Procurement. I knew the rhythm of the floor, the scent of the industrial printers, and the exact moment when the afternoon light hit the linoleum in a way that made the whole office look like a spent matchbox. For 11 of those years, I was the man who made the gears turn. I was the one who tracked the logistics, managed the vendors, and ensured the supply chain remained unbroken. Then Victor arrived. Victor didn't understand procurement. He understood optics. He understood how to lean against a doorframe and make a person feel like a Tuesday afternoon mistake. "Andrew, there he is!" Victor shouted, his eyes locking onto mine. The circle of sycophants around him parted like a curtain. He beckoned me over with a thick, manicured hand. I didn't want to go, but in a room full of people who signed my checks, gravity always pulled toward the loudest voice. I walked over, keeping my expression neutral, my spine straight. I could feel the eyes of the junior associates on me, the pitying glances from the ones who knew I was being phased out, and the cold stares from the ones Victor had handpicked to replace my authority. "Andrew, we were just discussing the year-end awards," Victor said, throwing a heavy arm over my shoulder. The scent of bourbon and expensive aftershave rolled off him in waves. "I was telling the group that we need a special category this year, something for the man who handles the most imaginative paperwork." A few people chuckled. It was a nervous, jagged sound. They knew what he was doing. Victor had spent the last 6 months forcing me to approve contracts for consulting firms that had no physical addresses, only P.O. boxes in Delaware. When I questioned the lack of deliverables, he'd simply tell me to be a team player and sign the digital forms. "I just follow the trail you lay out, Victor," I said quietly. He squeezed my shoulder, his grip tightening until it pinched the nerve. "That's the problem, Andy. You're a follower, a bean counter. But we're a visionary company now. We need leaders, not librarians." He turned back to the crowd, his voice rising for the punchline. "In fact, I'm thinking of a new title for our friend here. Worst Employee of the Year. Any objections?" The room went quiet for a heartbeat, the kind of silence that feels heavy and wet. Then a few people laughed. Then more. It wasn't because the joke was good. It was because Victor was the one who told it. I stood there, the center of their amusement, and I did the one thing Victor didn't expect. I smiled. I let the corners of my mouth lift just enough to look like I was in on the joke. "I'll need a trophy for that, Victor," I said. "Maybe something in brass." He laughed, a loud braying sound, and slapped my back before turning away to find a fresh drink. He thought he had won. He thought that by stripping away my dignity in front of the logistics team, he had finalized my obsolescence. He didn't realize that while he was performing for the room, I was performing for him. I left the party 20 minutes later. The cold December air hit me like a physical weight as I walked across the salted parking lot to my sedan. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, the engine idling, the heater blowing lukewarm air against my knees. My mind was a filing cabinet, and I was currently opening the drawer marked October. I remembered the specific vendor ID for a company called Apex Logistics, a firm that charged us 40% above market rate for shipping containers that never seemed to arrive at our warehouse. I remembered the digital signature on those approvals. It wasn't mine. Victor had used my credentials while I was out on a forced 3-day leave in November. He thought he was clever, leaving a trail that ended at my desk. He didn't know I had been running a keystroke logger on my own workstation since the day he started asking me to bypass standard protocols. When I got home, the house was silent. My wife had left 2 years ago, citing my obsession with a job that didn't love me back. She wasn't wrong, though she had been wrong about the reason. It wasn't obsession, it was observation. I went to my small home office, a room filled with stacks of printed spreadsheets and 3 different monitors. I didn't turn on the overhead light. The glow from the screens was enough. I logged into the secure remote server I had set up months ago. I began to pull the files. Every forced approval. Every redirected shipment, every email where Victor suggested I look the other way regarding the kickbacks from the steel providers. He was sloppy. He relied on the fact that most people are too intimidated by a loud voice to look at the fine print. He assumed I was a broken man because I let him mock me. He didn't understand that a man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous person in the building. I worked through the night. The clock on the wall ticked with a steady, mechanical rhythm that matched the clicking of my mouse. There was a certain beauty in the data. It was a map of a man's greed, a blueprint of how to dismantle a career 1 decimal point at a time. By 4 a.m., I had the full picture. Victor wasn't just skimming, he was hollow out the company's pension fund through a series of shell vendors. He was taking the futures of every person who had laughed at me tonight and putting them into his personal brokerage account. He thought he was untouchable because he had the board of directors in his pocket. He thought he had me framed as the fall guy for when the auditors eventually knocked. But I had the logs. I had the timestamps. I had the IP addresses that proved the signatures originated from his office, not mine. I looked at the folder on my screen. I could have sent it to the authorities right then. I could have called the firm's legal counsel. But that wasn't what I wanted. If I involved the law, the process would be slow, bureaucratic, and Victor might find a way to slide out of the consequences. He might hire a team of expensive lawyers to bury the truth in motions and delays. I wanted something more direct. I wanted to see the moment the floor vanished beneath his feet. I wanted to be the one who pulled the lever. The sun began to rise, casting a gray, bruised light across the frost on my window. I stood up and stretched, my muscles aching from the tension. I felt a strange sense of clarity. The fear that had lived in my chest for the last year was gone, replaced by a cold, hard weight. I drove back to the office at 7:30 a.m. The building looked different in the morning light, less like a place of business and more like a stage. I walked through the lobby, nodding to the security guard who had known me for a decade. He looked at me with a bit of sympathy, likely having heard about the award Victor had given me the night before. "Morning, Andrew," he said. "Morning, Pete," I replied. "It's going to be a busy day." I went to my cubicle and sat down. I didn't open my email, I didn't check my voicemail, I simply waited. At 9 a.m., I heard the heavy tread of Victor's boots on the carpet. He was whistling. He stepped into my peripheral vision, leaning against the fabric wall of my workspace. "Late night, Andy? You look like you've been through a blender," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Just finishing up some paperwork, Victor," I said, not looking up from my blank monitor. "The kind of imaginative paperwork we talked about." He chuckled and tapped the top of my monitor. "That's my boy. Get those approvals through for the Q1 steel buy. I need them finalized by noon. Don't make me ask twice." He walked away, his confidence radiating off him like heat. I watched him go, noting the way he adjusted his jacket, the way he stopped to flirt with the receptionist. He felt like the king of the world. I opened my private drive and looked at the resignation folder. Inside was a document that wasn't a letter of departure, but a comprehensive map of every transaction Victor had ever tried to hide. It was addressed to the primary investors, the insurance underwriters, and the internal audit team at our largest client. I didn't send it yet. The timing had to be perfect. I needed him to feel the peak of his power before the drop. I needed him to be in the middle of a meeting, in the middle of a boast, when the notifications started hitting everyone's phones. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a small, physical notebook. In it, I had written down the names of everyone who had laughed the loudest at the party. I wasn't going to hurt them. I was just going to make sure they were in the room when the lights went out. My phone buzzed. It was a calendar invite for a 10:30 a.m. strategic alignment meeting in the main conference room. Victor was the organizer. The entire senior staff was invited. I clicked accept. I stood up and walked toward the break room to get a cup of coffee. As I passed the large windows overlooking the city, I saw the first few flakes of a coming snowstorm. The sky was a flat, featureless white. It was the kind of day where everything stops, where the world goes quiet under a layer of ice. I took a sip of the bitter black coffee and felt it warm my throat. My hands were perfectly steady. I wasn't the man I had been 24 hours ago. That man was gone, buried under a year of insults and forced signatures. The man standing here now was something else entirely. I was a procurement manager. I knew exactly what everything cost, and I was finally ready to collect the payment. The fluorescent lights in the main conference room had a specific, rhythmic hum that usually faded into the background, but today it sounded like a countdown. I sat at the far end of the mahogany table, the seat furthest from the head, where the air conditioning vent blew a steady stream of chilled air onto the back of my neck. Victor was at the front, naturally, pacing the length of the glass wall that looked out over the manufacturing floor. Below us, the assembly lines were moving with a sluggish, mechanical indifference, oblivious to the fact that the man overseeing their budget was currently bleeding the company's future into a private account. The room was filled with the senior leads, Sarah from accounting, Marcus from logistics, and Dave from operations. They were the ones who had laughed the loudest at the party. Now they sat with their tablets open, their faces illuminated by the pale blue light of their screens, waiting for Victor to begin his sermon. None of them looked at me. To them, I was already a ghost, a remnant of a previous administration that had stayed too long at the table. "Focus, people," Victor said, clapping his hands together. The sound was sharp, echoing off the glass. "We are looking at a record-breaking first quarter. The projections I've laid out show a 20% increase in efficiency, mostly due to the new vendor partnerships we've solidified in the last 90 days. He glanced at me, a smirk playing on his lips. It was a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. He had successfully used my credentials to bypass the final checks on the Apex logistics contracts, and he thought the paper trail was buried under my reputation for incompetence. "Andrew, you've been quiet," Victor said, leaning over the table. "Usually you're the first one to complain about the overhead on these new contracts. Nothing to say today? No concerns about the logistics?" I leaned back, interlacing my fingers behind my head. "The numbers are exactly what you asked for, Victor. I've ensured the files are updated. Everything is integrated into the central server now." "Good," Victor said, turning back to the group, "because I've invited the board's regional chair to join us via video link in 20 minutes. We're going to walk him through the savings. This is the moment we prove that the old ways of doing things, the slow, cautious, document-heavy ways, are over." He started a slideshow, a series of bright, aggressive charts that showed costs falling and productivity rising. It was a beautiful lie. Every cost reduction shown on the screen was actually a redirected payment to a shell company. He was stripping the insulation out of the walls to keep the furnace running for one last night, and everyone in the room was warming their hands by the fire, unaware that the structure was about to collapse. I looked down at my watch. It was 10:42 a.m. In my pocket, I felt the slight weight of my personal phone. I had set a sequence of automated tasks to trigger at 11 a.m. sharp. It wasn't just a resignation, it was an evidentiary dump to every regulatory agency and insurance auditor on our list. As Victor continued to talk, his voice rising with the excitement of his own deception, I found myself noticing the small things. The way Sarah from accounting chewed on the end of her pen. The way Marcus kept checking his watch, likely thinking about his lunch reservation. They were all so comfortable. They believed in the hierarchy because the hierarchy protected them. They didn't understand that a hierarchy is only as strong as its foundation, and Victor had replaced the concrete with sand. "I'm going to step out for a moment," I said, standing up. Victor stopped mid-sentence, his brow furrowing. "We're in the middle of the presentation, Andrew. The board chair will be on the line in 10 minutes. "I just need to verify the final shipment logs," I said calmly. "I wouldn't want there to be any discrepancies when the chair asks about the Delaware vendors." Victor's expression flickered for a fraction of a second. It was the slightest tightening of the eyes, a momentary break in his armor. He knew I was referencing the shell companies, but he was so convinced of his own control that he mistook my statement for a final act of subservience. He thought I was going to scrub the logs one last time to protect him. "Fine," he snapped. "Make it quick, and bring the physical folder for the Apex contract. I want to hold the hard copy when I give the presentation." "Of course," I said. I walked out of the conference room and into the quiet hallway. The carpet muffled my footsteps. I didn't go to my desk. I went to the server room at the end of the hall. Access was restricted, but as the senior procurement manager, I still had the bypass code for emergency maintenance. I swiped my card and entered the small, refrigerated room. The sound of the cooling fans was a roar compared to the silence of the office. I sat down at the terminal and opened the internal log. I could see the activity from the conference room. Victor's tablet was connected to the main display. I navigated to the directory where he had stored his private notes. He had been arrogant enough to keep a running tally of his commissions in a password-protected file on the company drive, likely thinking no one would ever look past the first layer of encryption. I didn't delete anything. I simply moved the files. I placed them in the public presentations folder, the one that the board chair would be viewing during the video call. Then I set a delay script. The files wouldn't appear for another 12 minutes. I left the server room and walked back toward the main office area. As I passed the break room, I saw the television mounted on the wall. The news was showing the weather. The snowstorm was moving in faster than expected. The sky outside the window was now a dark, bruised violet. The first heavy flakes were beginning to stick to the glass, blurring the world outside into a white haze. I went to my desk and picked up a single, empty folder. I didn't need any papers. The truth wasn't on paper anymore. It was in the air, a digital ghost waiting to manifest. As I walked back toward the conference room, I saw one of the junior associates, a kid named Tyler, standing by the printer. He looked stressed, his tie loosened, his eyes tired. He had been one of the people Victor had forced to work through the last 3 weekends to reconcile the phantom inventory. "Andrew," Tyler whispered as I passed, "is it true about the layoffs? I heard Victor talking about a restructuring after the Q1 report." I stopped and looked at him. I saw the genuine fear in his eyes. He had a mortgage, probably a car payment, and a belief that if he worked hard, he would be rewarded. Victor was going to ruin him along with everyone else just to add another digit to a bank balance in a tax haven. "Don't worry about the layoffs, Tyler," I said, my voice low and steady. "The company is going to be under new management much sooner than you think. You might want to take an early lunch today. Go home before the snow gets too bad." He looked confused, but he nodded. I continued on to the conference room. When I entered, the atmosphere had changed. The large screen at the front of the room was now displaying a digital waiting room. The board chair's name, Arthur Sterling, was visible at the top of the screen. Victor was standing at the head of the table, straightening his cuffs, looking like a man about to receive a coronation. "Did you get it?" Victor asked, eyeing the folder in my hand. "Right here," I said, laying the empty folder on the table in front of him. He didn't open it. He just tapped it with a confident finger. "Excellent. Sit down, Andrew. Watch how a real executive handles a room." I sat. The clock on the wall reached 11 Gao a.m. In my pocket, I felt my phone vibrate once, twice, 3 times. The automated emails were out. The reports were landing in inboxes across the country. The insurance underwriters were receiving the proof of the shell company transfers. The auditors were seeing the keystroke logs that proved Victor had used my account to forge signatures. On the screen, the waiting room disappeared, replaced by the face of Arthur Sterling. He was an older man with a sharp, no-nonsense expression. He was sitting in a high-backed leather chair in an office that looked like it cost more than our entire manufacturing floor. "Victor," Sterling said, his voice crackling slightly through the speakers, "I've been looking forward to this. I hear you have some remarkable news regarding our procurement savings." "I do indeed, Arthur," Victor said, beaming. "We've managed to trim the fat in ways the previous management thought impossible. I've prepared a detailed breakdown of the vendor transitions. If you look at the shared folder on your end, you'll see the Q1 growth presentation." "One moment," Sterling said, leaning forward to look at his own screen. The room was silent. I watched Victor's face. He was smiling, waiting for the praise, waiting for the validation of his genius. He didn't notice that his own tablet, mirrored on the wall behind him, was beginning to refresh. "Victor," Sterling said, his voice suddenly cold, "I'm seeing a folder here, but it's not labeled growth. It's labeled personal commissions and Apex transfers. What is this?" The smile on Victor's face didn't disappear. It froze. It became a mask of confusion. I'm sorry, Arthur. There must be a technical glitch. Andrew, check the link." I didn't move. I didn't reach for the keyboard. I just sat there watching the screen. "I'm looking at a spreadsheet, Victor," Sterling continued, his voice rising in volume. "It lists 4 different offshore accounts, and it seems to match the transaction IDs for our steel procurement for the last 6 months. There's also a series of internal logs showing your IP address accessing Andrew Collins' workstation at midnight on 3 separate occasions." The silence in the room was now absolute. Sarah, Marcus, and Dave all turned their heads in slow motion, looking from the screen to Victor, and then, finally, to me. Victor's face went from flushed to a pale, sickly gray. He looked at the folder I had placed in front of him. He reached out and flipped it open. His eyes widened as he saw the empty interior. "Andrew," he whispered, his voice cracking, "what did you do?" I leaned forward, the light from the screen reflecting in my eyes. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel joy. I felt a profound sense of weightlessness, as if the world had finally corrected its rotation. "I didn't do anything, Victor," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the room and into the microphone. "I just stopped holding everything together for you. I thought you wanted us to be a visionary company. This is the vision. It's very clear now, isn't it?" Sterling's voice boomed through the speakers. "Victor, stay where you are. I've already contacted the firm's legal counsel and the authorities. No one leaves that room until our security team arrives." Victor looked at the glass wall. Outside, the snow was falling so heavily now that the manufacturing floor was invisible. The world had vanished into a wall of white. He looked back at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He looked for a friend, a supporter, or an excuse. He found nothing but the cold blue light of the screens. I stood up slowly. I picked up my phone and slipped it into my pocket. "Where are you going?" Victor stammered, his hand shaking as he pointed at me. You're part of this. You signed the papers." "The logs say otherwise, Victor," I said. "And as of 5 minutes ago, I no longer work here. I resigned. You'll find the email in your inbox, right next to the notification from the board." I walked toward the door. No one tried to stop me. Marcus and Dave moved their chairs back to give me space, their faces pale with the sudden realization that the man they had mocked was the only one who had survived the blast. As I reached the door, I turned back one last time. Victor was slumped in his chair, staring at the empty folder, the roar of the server fans the only sound left in the room. I walked out into the hallway, heading for the exit. The building felt hollow. The power was still on, the lights were still humming, but the heart of the machine had stopped. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the lobby and stepped out into the storm. The cold air was a physical relief. The snow was thick and silent, covering the parking lot in a clean white shroud. I walked to my car, my footsteps the only marks on the fresh ground. I didn't look back at the windows. I didn't think about what was happening inside. I just started the engine and began the slow drive home, the world disappearing into the white behind me. The silence of my house was no longer the heavy, oppressive weight it had been for the last year. It felt like a clean slate. I sat at my kitchen table, the only light coming from the street lamp outside reflecting off the mounting snow, and I watched the clock. It was nearly midnight. In the corporate world, time is measured in quarters and fiscal cycles, but for a man waiting for a storm to break, time is measured in heartbeats and the slow crawl of a loading bar. The resignation email had been the first domino. By now, Victor's phone would be a relentless source of noise. Every chime would be a fresh reminder of a wall closing in. I could imagine him in his oversized suburban home, pacing the length of his granite countertops, trying to find a person left on his side of the board. But I had been thorough. I hadn't just exposed the shell companies. I had mapped the social architecture of his entire circle. Every person he had used to insulate himself had been CC'd on a different, specific set of documents that proved he was planning to sacrifice them to save his own standing. I opened my laptop. The internal company portal was already buzzing with activity. Usually the forums and project boards were quiet after hours, but tonight the digital workspace was alive with the frantic energy of people who had realized the ship was taking on water. I scrolled through the threads. Emergency meeting called for 8 a.m., one headline read. Payroll concerns, read another. I saw Tyler's name pop up in a private message window. Andrew, are you there? Everyone is panicking. Security escorted Victor out an hour ago. He was shouting about a setup. Is it true? Are we going under? I didn't reply. I wasn't his mentor anymore, and I wasn't the procurement manager. I was the person who had pulled the plug. I closed the laptop and felt the stillness return. The next phase required a different kind of precision. Professional destruction is a clean, sharp process. It happens on screens and in boardrooms. Social humiliation, however, is a blunt instrument. It requires presence, though it requires looking a man in the eye while his world is reduced to rubble. I went to my closet and pulled out the suit I had intended to wear to the official New Year's gala, the one the company held for the high-level donors and city officials. It was scheduled for 2 days from now. Victor had spent months bragging about his keynote speech, about how he was going to be the face of the new Miller Procurement. He had even ordered a custom-made ice sculpture of the company logo. I spent the next hour preparing the physical evidence. I had 36 manila envelopes. In each one, I placed a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a spreadsheet or a legal brief. It was a copy of the Worst Employee of the Year award Victor had joked about at the office party, but I had edited the text. It now listed Victor's name, followed by the exact total of the funds he had diverted from the employee pension plan. I looked at the stacks of envelopes. They were heavy, tangible symbols of his arrogance. The following morning, the snow had stopped, leaving the city paralyzed under a thick, sparkling crust of ice. I drove toward the office, but I didn't park in my usual spot. I parked across the street near a coffee shop that had a clear view of the main entrance. I watched as the black SUVs of the internal audit team arrived. I watched as the local news van pulled up, a tip I had anonymously routed through a secure server. I saw Victor arrive at 10 a.m. He wasn't in his usual chauffeured car. He was driving himself, and he looked haggard. Even from across the street, I could see that his expensive coat was unbuttoned, his hair unkempt. He tried to walk through the front doors with his head held high, but the security guards, men who had nodded to him every morning for years, stepped into his path. They didn't use force. They simply formed a wall. He started shouting. He waved his arms, pointing at the building, likely invoking his title and his connections. But the guards didn't move. One of them handed him a cardboard box. It was the universal signal of corporate disposal. His personal belongings reduced to a single square of corrugated paper. I watched him take the box. He turned around, scanning the parking lot, his eyes darting back and forth like a trapped animal. He looked toward the coffee shop. For a second, our eyes met through the glass. He didn't recognize me at first. I was just a silhouette in a window, but then I raised my coffee cup in a silent toast. The recognition was instantaneous. His face contorted, a mask of pure, vibrating rage. He dropped the box, his stapler and a framed photo of his yacht clattering onto the icy pavement. He began to march across the street, ignoring the slush and the oncoming traffic. I didn't move. I didn't feel the urge to run. I just waited. He burst through the door of the coffee shop, the bell above the entrance chiming with a frantic tinny sound. The few patrons inside looked up, startled by the sudden intrusion of a man who looked like he was vibrating apart. "You!" he hissed, stepping toward my table. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his silk shirt. "You think you're so smart. You think you can just erase a career like mine? I built that company while you were counting paper clips." "You didn't build it, Victor," I said, my voice low and conversational. "You mined it. You treated the infrastructure like a quarry and the employees like the tools you used to dig. I just showed the owners where the holes were." "I'll have you in court by Monday," he spat. He leaned over the table, his hands trembling. "I have friends on the board who owe me more than you've ever earned. They'll bury you. They'll make sure you never work in this industry again." "The board is currently reviewing the Delaware filings, Victor," I said, sliding a single manila envelope across the table toward him. "And your friends are busy wiping their own servers. No one is coming to help you. You're an environmental hazard now. Everyone is just trying to make sure they aren't standing downwind when you collapse." He looked at the envelope but didn't touch it. "What is this? More fake numbers?" "It's a guest list," I said, "for the gala tomorrow night. I've taken the liberty of ensuring that every person on that list has a copy of the pension logs. I've also reached out to the caterers. I've sponsored the ice sculpture this year. It's no longer the company logo. It's a giant, transparent zero, a tribute to your remaining assets." Victor's face went a shade of gray that I hadn't thought possible for a living person. He finally realized that this wasn't a legal battle. It wasn't about the money anymore. I was stripping away the only thing he actually valued, his image. "I'll find you," he whispered. It wasn't a loud threat, but it was a heavy one. "I know where you live, Andrew. I know where you go." "I know," I said, standing up. I was several inches shorter than him, but in that moment, the space between us felt like a chasm. "But you should check your car first. I think you left your headlights on. Or maybe it was the engine. You're getting so forgetful lately, Victor. It must be the stress." He stared at me for a long beat, his eyes wide and unfocused. Then he turned and ran back out into the cold. I sat back down and finished my coffee. I felt a strange, humming energy in my limbs. It wasn't adrenaline. It was a sense of completion. I had spent years being the man who made sure the logistics were perfect, that every item arrived at its destination exactly when it was supposed to. This was just another delivery. I spent the rest of the afternoon in the city library. It was a neutral space, quiet and filled with the scent of old paper. I used their public computers to monitor the news. By 3:00 p.m., the first headlines appeared. Major manufacturing firm under federal audit. CEO ousted amid pension scandal. The comment sections were a flood of anger from employees and shareholders. I saw Marcus's name mentioned in one article. He was being questioned as a person of interest. Sarah had already issued a statement through a lawyer, claiming she was a victim of Victor's intimidation. The rats were not just leaving the ship, they were biting each other on the way down. As the sun began to set, casting long orange shadows across the reading room, I felt a sense of finality. The professional world was gone. The social world was crumbling. There was only one thing left, the physical reality of the man himself. I left the library and drove to a quiet parking structure near the waterfront. It was a place Victor used to go to meet his consultants away from the eyes of the office. I knew his schedule better than he did. I knew that when he was cornered, he went to the one place where he felt he still had an edge. I parked on the 3rd level, in the shadows near a concrete pillar. I didn't have to wait long. 20 minutes later, his black SUV swung into the structure. He was driving fast, the tires screeching against the cold concrete. He parked in his usual spot and sat there, the engine idling. I got out of my car and walked toward him. I didn't hide. I walked right into the glow of his headlights. He saw me and slammed the car into gear, the engine roaring. For a second, I thought he might actually try to hit me, but then he stopped. He gripped the steering wheel so hard I could see his knuckles through the windshield. I walked up to the driver's side window and tapped on the glass. He lowered it just an inch. "It's not over," he said, his voice ragged. "It's very nearly over, Victor," I said. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small thumb drive. I held it up so he could see it. "This is the last piece. The physical logs from the server room. The ones that prove you were in the building at midnight. I'm going to the gala tomorrow, Victor. I have a seat at the head table now. They've invited me to speak in your place." He looked at the drive, and I could see the gears turning in his head. He wanted to reach out and grab it. He wanted to crush it. But he knew that if I was here, showing it to him, It meant there were a dozen copies already in motion. "Why?" he asked. It was the first honest thing he had said since I met him. "I gave you a job. I kept you on when I could have cleared you out on day one." "You didn't keep me on because you were kind, Victor," I said. "You kept me on because you thought I was a tool. You thought you could use me to absorb the impact when you eventually hit the ground. But you forgot the most basic rule of procurement." I leaned in closer to the gap in the window. "Everything has a cost," I whispered, "and you're finally out of credit." I turned and walked away, leaving him in the idling car. I didn't look back as I heard him roar out of the garage, the sound of his engine echoing through the concrete chambers like a scream. I walked to the edge of the parking structure and looked out over the city. The lights were flickering on, thousands of small, distant sparks against the dark. Somewhere out there, the gala was being prepared. The ice was being carved, the chairs were being set. I had one more day of work to do. The morning of the gala arrived with a sky so clear it looked brittle. The snow from the previous day had been packed down into a treacherous iron-gray sheet that covered the city streets. I spent the early hours in a quiet ritual of preparation, polishing my shoes until the black leather mirrored the dim light of my kitchen. There was no haste in my movements. When you have spent years managing the intricate flow of a supply chain, you understand that the most critical phase of any operation is the transition from planning to execution. I checked my inbox one final time. The corporate world was in a state of absolute thermal runaway. The board of directors had issued a formal statement at 8 a.m., scrubbing Victor Lane's name from the company website as if he had never existed. They were pivoting, attempting to frame themselves as the vigilant guardians who had uncovered a rogue agent. It was a predictable maneuver, and one I had already accounted for. I had sent a separate, delayed release package to the lead investigator at the Regional Insurance Bureau, ensuring that the board's discovery would be seen for what it was, a desperate attempt to avoid liability for their own lack of oversight. By noon, my phone began to chime with calls from numbers I didn't recognize. Reporters, lawyers, perhaps even Sarah or Marcus looking for a way to align themselves with the man who held the keys. I silenced the device and placed it face down on the counter. I didn't need to speak to them. The document spoke with a clarity I could never achieve in conversation. I spent the afternoon at a high-end menswear shop on the north side of the city. I wasn't there to shop. I was there because I knew Victor's personal tailor was located 3 doors down. I stood on the sidewalk, a heavy wool coat buttoned to my chin, and watched the entrance. At 2:15 p.m., a familiar black town car pulled to the curb. Victor stepped out. He looked like a man who had aged a decade in 24 hours. His suit was wrinkled, and his movements were jerky, lacking the practiced fluidness of a man who believed he owned the pavement. He was there to pick up his tuxedo for the gala. Even with his world crumbling, his vanity remained intact. He still intended to show up. He still believed he could talk his way back into the room, that his presence could somehow intimidate the reality of the situation into changing. I watched him enter the tailor's shop and wait. 5 minutes later, he emerged, but he wasn't carrying a garment bag. He was empty-handed, and the tailor was standing in the doorway, arms crossed, shaking his head. The message was clear. His credit was no longer good. Even his personal services were being severed. Victor stood on the sidewalk, his face turning a dark, blotchy purple, shouting at the man in the doorway. The tailor simply stepped back and closed the door, locking it with a sharp, audible click. Victor turned toward his car, and for a moment, he looked completely lost. He looked at the pedestrians passing by, searching for a face that would offer him the deference he was used to. He found nothing but the cold indifference of a city that had already moved on. I stepped out from the shadow of the awning and walked toward him. He didn't see me until I was 10 feet away. "They won't even give you the clothes, Victor," I asked. He jumped, his shoulders hunching as he spun around. His eyes were red, the whites yellowed from lack of sleep. "You're following me now? Is that the plan? You're going to haunt me?" "I'm just observing the final delivery," I said. "It's a shame about the tuxedo. It's going to be a very formal event, though I suppose a man in your position should get used to being underdressed for the occasion." "I'm going to that event," he growled, stepping into my personal space. He smelled of stale cigarettes and something sour. "I'm going to stand at that podium, and I'm going to tell them exactly how you manipulated the logs. I'm going to tell them you were the one who set up the Delaware accounts." "You can tell them whatever you like," I replied, my voice remaining flat and calm. "But logic is a difficult thing to argue with. Why would the man who set up the accounts be the one to provide the passwords to the auditors? Why would the man who diverted the funds be the one who remained in a modest house while you bought a yacht with a name that matches a shell company?" He lunged forward, grabbing the lapel of my coat. His breath was hot against my face. "I will take you down with me. If I'm going to lose everything, I'll make sure you're sitting right next to me in the dirt." I didn't flinch. I didn't even raise my hands to move his. I simply looked at him with a level of detachment that seemed to unnerve him more than any physical retaliation could have. You're making a scene, Victor. People are watching. And I think that's your town car driver over there, looking at his watch. I wonder if he knows your personal accounts were frozen 3 hours ago. He's probably wondering if he's going to get paid for this trip. Victor's grip loosened. He looked back at the driver, then back at me. The bravado was leaking out of him, replaced by a frantic, vibrating desperation. He let go of my coat and smoothed his own jacket with trembling hands. "You think you've won," he whispered. "But you've just turned yourself into a target. The people on that board, they don't like whistleblowers. They like quiet. You've made a lot of noise, Andrew. Noise is expensive." "I've already accounted for the cost," I said. He got into the car without another word. I watched the vehicle pull away, merging into the sluggish flow of traffic. I felt a strange sense of professional satisfaction. I had successfully managed his emotional state, pushing him exactly where I needed him to be, off balance, desperate, and committed to a final public appearance where he would be most vulnerable. I spent the next few hours at a small, anonymous diner on the edge of the financial district. I ate a slow meal, watching the sunset through the greasy windows. The sky turned a deep, bruised gold, then faded into a cold, translucent violet. My mind was busy running through the logistics of the evening. The gala was being held at the Grand Regency, a place of marble floors and vaulted ceilings. It was the kind of environment Victor loved. It amplified his voice and reflected his image. It was also the perfect place for a collapse. At 7 p.m., I returned home and changed into my suit. I took my time with the tie, ensuring the knot was perfectly symmetrical. I placed the final thumb drive in my inner pocket. This wasn't for the auditors or the board. This was for the screen in the ballroom. I arrived at the Grand Regency at 8:30 p.m. The valet took my car, and I walked up the wide stone steps, flanked by enormous ice sculptures that were already beginning to weep in the slightly warmer air of the lobby. The entrance was a gauntlet of flashbulbs and forced smiles. I handed my invitation to the attendant. He looked at the name, paused for a fraction of a second, and then looked at me with a new, sharp interest. "Mr. Collins," he said, his voice dropping an octave, "you're expected. The board has requested that you join them in the VIP lounge before the dinner begins." "I'll be there in a moment," I said. "I'd like to see the ballroom first." I walked through the heavy oak doors. The room was a sea of white linen, crystal, and silver. Hundreds of people were already there, their voices merging into a low, continuous hum that sounded like a hive. At the center of the room, on a raised dais, sat the ice sculpture I had sponsored. It was a massive, hollow zero, carved with such precision that it looked like a ring of frozen light. I saw Sarah and Marcus near the bar. They were huddled together, speaking in low tones, their eyes constantly scanning the room. They saw me and immediately turned away, moving deeper into the crowd. They were the casualties of a war they hadn't realized was being fought until the first shells landed. I made my way to the AV booth at the back of the hall. The technician was a young man with headphones around his neck, looking bored as he scrolled through a playlist. "I have the updated presentation from the board," I said, handing him the thumb drive. "They want this to run on a loop during the opening remarks. It's the new transparency initiative." He didn't even look at the files. He just plugged it in. "Sure thing. Transparency is the big word of the night, I guess." "Exactly," I said. I left the booth and headed toward the VIP lounge. I could feel the eyes of the room on me. The news had traveled fast. I was no longer the invisible manager. I was the man who had torn the veil. Inside the lounge, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and nervous energy. Arthur Sterling was there, standing by the window, his back to the room. He turned as I entered, his expression unreadable. "Andrew," he said, "you've caused a significant amount of work for our legal team today." "I've also saved the firm approximately $4 million in ongoing annual losses," I replied. "A calculated trade," Sterling said, stepping toward me. "We've decided to offer you the interim director of procurement position. We need a steady hand to manage the transition, someone who understands the finer details of our contracts." It was the move I had expected. They wanted to pull me in, to make me part of the structure so that I would have a vested interest in keeping the rest of the secrets buried. It was a bribe disguised as a promotion. "I appreciate the offer, Arthur," I said, "but I think you should wait until after the presentation to finalize any titles. The evening is still young." Before he could respond, the doors to the lounge swung open. Victor Lane stepped in. He had found a tuxedo. It didn't fit him well, the sleeves too short, the waist too tight, but he had found one. He looked around the room, his eyes landing on me with a terrifying intensity. "Get him out of here," Victor said, pointing at me. His voice was loud, cutting through the sophisticated murmur of the lounge. "He's a thief. He's the one who moved the money." Arthur Sterling looked at Victor with a cold, disgusted pity. "Victor, you are here as a courtesy only because your name is still on the program. Do not make this more difficult than it already is." "Difficult?" Victor laughed, a jagged, desperate sound. "You have no idea how difficult this is going to get." He walked toward me, his face inches from mine. He was vibrating with a physical, kinetic rage. I could feel the heat radiating from him. "You think you've won," he hissed. "But look at them. They don't want you. They want the money back, and once they have it, you're just a witness, and witnesses are liabilities." "I'm not a witness, Victor," I said softly, so only he could hear. "I'm the auditor, and the audit is just beginning." The chime for dinner rang throughout the hotel. The crowd began to move toward the ballroom. I walked past Victor, my shoulder brushing his, and followed the board toward the head table. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The logistics were finalized. The delivery was on time. The only thing left was the impact. The grand ballroom was a cathedral of excess, lit by chandeliers that hung like frozen explosions of glass. As the 300 guests took their seats, the sound of silver scraping against china created a low-frequency grit that seemed to vibrate in my teeth. I sat at the secondary head table, a position that offered a perfect panoramic view of the room. To my left sat a junior partner from the firm's legal counsel who spent the entire appetizer course staring at his reflection in a spoon. To my right, the seat remained empty, a silent testament to the fact that I was still an island in this sea of high-priced formalware. Victor was seated 3 tables away. He was leaning into the personal space of a local city councilman, gesturing wildly with a champagne flute. From this distance, he looked like a man performing a frantic pantomime of success. He was laughing too loud, nodding too vigorously, and sweating through his ill-fitting tuxedo. Every few minutes, his gaze would snap toward me, a quick, jagged motion of the neck that betrayed his obsession. He was looking for a sign of weakness, a crack in the granite of my composure. He found nothing but the steady, rhythmic movement of a man enjoying a salad. The main course was served with mechanical precision. I watched the waitstaff navigate the tight corridors between chairs, their movements a complex choreography of service. It reminded me of the warehouse floor, the way the forklifts used to weave through the pallet racks before Victor started cutting the safety budgets to pad the quarterly returns. Those cuts had resulted in 3 major equipment failures in November alone. I had documented each one, along with the memo where Victor had explicitly ordered me to ignore the maintenance schedules and keep the line moving. As the plates were cleared, Arthur Sterling stood up and approached the podium. The room settled into a polite, expectant hush. Sterling was a master of the corporate pivot. He spoke for 10 minutes about the resilience of the institution and the necessity of transparency in a changing global market. He used grand, sweeping words to distance the company from the very man who had been his golden boy only a month prior. "We have faced challenges," Sterling said, his voice resonant and authoritative. "But a firm is not defined by the actions of one individual. It is defined by its response to those actions. Tonight, we look forward. We have initiated a full internal review, led by our own senior management, to ensure that the integrity of our procurement processes remains beyond reproach." It was a beautiful speech. It was also a lie. The internal review was a controlled demolition designed to bury the most incriminating evidence under a pile of redacted spreadsheets. I looked at the AV booth. The technician caught my eye and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "And now," Sterling continued, "before we move to our keynote, I'd like to present a brief visual summary of our projected path for the next fiscal year." The lights dimmed. A massive projection screen lowered from the ceiling, cutting through the shadows like a blade. The hum of the crowd transitioned into a quiet, focused anticipation. The presentation didn't start with the projected path. The first image to appear on the screen was a high-resolution scan of a handwritten ledger. It was Victor's private commissions book, the one he had kept in his home office, which I had photographed during a weekend when I was supposedly helping him move his furniture. The handwriting was unmistakable. It listed dates, amounts, and the names of 3 people currently sitting in this very room. The silence that followed was not the polite hush of a speech. It was the absolute airless silence of a vacuum. The screen flickered, transitioning to a series of internal emails. These weren't the sanitized versions the legal team had prepared. These were the raw exchanges between Victor and the shell company representatives. The language was coarse, transactional, and utterly damning. I don't care about the quality," one of Victor's emails read. "Just make sure the invoice matches the procurement code. Collins will sign whatever I put in front of him. He's too afraid of his own shadow to look at the numbers." I looked at Victor. He had stood up, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound like a gunshot. His face was no longer gray. It was a translucent, ghostly white. He looked at the screen, then at Sterling, then at the room full of donors who were now looking at him with a mixture of horror and predatory interest. "Turn it off," Victor shouted, his voice cracking. "That's private property. That's stolen data." The technician in the booth didn't move. I had ensured that the script running the presentation was locked behind a triple encrypted firewall that only I could bypass. The next slide was the most impactful. It was a side-by-side comparison of the employee pension fund balances against the growth of Victor's offshore accounts. The graph was a perfect inverse. As the workers' futures dipped toward the bottom of the axis, Victor's personal wealth spiked toward the ceiling. The numbers were staggering. It wasn't just skimming, it was a systematic harvest. "This is a fabrication!" Victor yelled, stepping into the aisle. He was stumbling, his hand catching the edge of a table and sending a wine glass shattering to the floor. "Andrew Collins did this. He's a disgruntled employee. He's trying to destroy me because I called him out." I stood up slowly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The room was so quiet that even a whisper would have carried to the back rows. "The logs don't have feelings, Victor," I said. "They don't have a grudge. They just have the truth. Every timestamp on those emails matches your login credentials. Every transfer into those accounts originated from your office." Victor began to move toward the dais, his eyes fixed on me. He looked like a man who had lost all sense of his surroundings. He was no longer an executive at a gala. He was a cornered animal in a tuxedo. "You think you can just sit there?" he screamed. "You think you're better than me? You signed the approvals. You're just as guilty." "I signed them under duress," I said, stepping out from behind my table. "And I recorded every conversation where you threatened my employment to make me do it. Those recordings are currently being uploaded to the regional news server. I believe the first clips are going live in about 3 minutes." The room erupted. It wasn't applause, it was chaos. People were standing, reaching for their phones, shouting at Sterling, shouting at Victor. The carefully constructed artifice of the evening had vanished, replaced by the raw, jagged reality of a public execution. Victor reached the edge of the stage. He tried to climb up, his foot slipping on the polished wood. He fell to one knee, his hands clawing at the air. He looked up at Arthur Sterling, searching for the protection he had been promised. Sterling didn't even look down. He turned his back on Victor and walked off the stage, disappearing through the service doors. I walked toward the exit. I didn't want to be there for the aftermath. I had delivered the package, the rest was just physics. As I passed the ice sculpture of the Zero, I saw that it was melting rapidly in the heat of the crowded room. Water was dripping from the center of the ring, pooling on the floor like a slow, transparent leak. I reached the lobby and stepped out onto the stone steps. The cold air hit me, refreshing and sharp. I looked back through the glass doors and saw the security team finally moving in. They weren't there to protect Victor, they were there to escort him out. I walked down the steps, my shoes clicking against the stone. I felt a strange sense of lightness, as if a great weight had been lifted from my shoulders. For years, I had been the man who carried the burdens of others, the man who ensured that the mistakes of the powerful were smoothed over and forgotten. I was no longer that man. I reached the parking lot and found my car. As I pulled out into the street, I saw a black SUV pulling up to the hotel. It wasn't a company car. It was marked with the seal of the State Financial Crimes Unit. They were early. I had timed the delivery perfectly. I drove toward the waterfront, the city lights blurred by the falling snow. I felt a calm, steady hum in my limbs. I had one final task to complete, one final interaction to ensure that the closure was absolute. I drove to Victor's house. It was a massive, modern structure of glass and steel, perched on a hill overlooking the river. It was a monument to the money he had stolen, a physical manifestation of his ego. I parked at the end of the driveway and waited. 20 minutes later, a taxi pulled up. Victor stumbled out. He didn't have his coat. His tuxedo jacket was torn at the shoulder, and his tie was gone. He looked like a man who had been dragged through a hedge. He stood in the driveway, staring at his house as if he didn't recognize it. I got out of my car and walked toward him. "It's a nice house, Victor," I said. He spun around, his eyes wide and wild. He didn't have any anger left. He just had a hollow, vibrating fear. "What do you want? Haven't you done enough? You destroyed my life in front of everyone I know." "I didn't destroy it," I said. "I just revealed it. There's a difference." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a final piece of paper. It was a copy of the lien that had been placed on the property 3 hours ago. "The insurance company has already moved to freeze the assets," I said. "They're using the house as collateral for the pension recovery. You have about 48 hours before they change the locks." Victor looked at the paper, then at the house, then at me. He looked like he wanted to say something, to offer one last excuse or one last threat. but his mouth just hung open, silent and empty. "I'll see you around, Victor," I said. I turned and walked back to my car. I didn't look back as I drove away. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what he looked like standing there in the cold, a man who had everything and now had nothing but the clothes on his back and a debt he could never pay. The revenge wasn't just in the loss. It was in the realization. He had spent his whole life thinking he was the one in control, the one who moved the pieces on the board. He had finally realized that he was just another item in the inventory. And I was the one who had conducted the final audit. The final morning arrived with a stillness that felt engineered. The city was buried under a fresh, thick blanket of white, muffling the sound of traffic and the persistent hum of the urban machinery. I sat in my car outside the corporate headquarters, watching the steam from my breath vanish into the cold interior air. I didn't turn on the heater. I wanted to feel the bite of the temperature. I wanted to stay sharp. Today was the day the transition became permanent. The building looked different now. The Miller Procurement logo, once a symbol of stability and reach, seemed diminished against the gray sky. Security was tight at the perimeter. 2 black vehicles were parked near the entrance, and I recognized the men standing by the glass doors. They weren't company security. They were federal agents, their presence a silent confirmation that the data I had released had reached the necessary hands. The audit was no longer an internal matter. It was an autopsy of a corporate identity. I checked my watch. 9:00 a.m. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance. My movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely devoid of the anxiety that had shadowed me for a decade. As I approached the doors, one of the agents stepped forward, his eyes scanning my face. "Andrew Collins?" he asked. "I am," I replied. "Mr. Sterling is expecting you in the boardroom. We've cleared the floor of all non-essential personnel." I nodded and walked past him. The lobby was eerie. The reception desk was empty, the phone silent for the first time in years. The air felt thin, stripped of the frantic energy that usually defined this space. I took the elevator to the top floor. When the doors opened, I was met with the sight of Arthur Sterling standing by the window, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked smaller than he had at the gala, his tailored suit unable to mask the sudden slump in his posture. "You didn't just target Victor, Andrew," Sterling said without turning around. "You poisoned the entire well. The investors are pulling out. The insurance providers have revoked our liability coverage. We are effectively a shell by the end of the business day." "A shell is what you were already becoming," I said, walking to the center of the room. "Victor was just the one who accelerated the process. You provided the environment that allowed him to thrive. You looked at the growth and chose not to look at the methods. In procurement, we call that a failure of oversight." Sterling turned, his eyes tired. "And what do you call what you've done? You've put 500 people out of work." "No," I said firmly. "I've stopped the theft of their futures. If I had waited another 6 months, the pension fund would have been entirely liquidated. Now, at least, the assets are frozen. There will be a recovery. They will get a percentage of what they earned, rather than 0% of what Victor stole." I laid a final document on the mahogany table. It was my formal severance agreement, drafted by my own hand. It didn't ask for a bonus or a glowing recommendation. It simply stated that I was retaining all copies of the internal logs for my own protection, and that I would provide testimony only under the condition of full immunity from the actions Victor had coerced me into performing. "Sign it, Arthur," I said. "It's the last thing you'll sign as the head of this firm." Sterling looked at the paper for a long time. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, the kind of silence that follows a massive structural collapse. Finally, he picked up a pen and scrawled his name at the bottom of the page. He didn't look at me as he slid it back across the table. "Get out," he whispered. I took the document, folded it carefully, and placed it in my inner pocket. I walked out of the boardroom and down the hall, passing Victor's old office. The door was open. The desk had been cleared, the computer removed. It looked like a hotel room after the guest had checked out. Anonymous, cold, and stripped of personality. I descended to the manufacturing floor one last time. The machines were idle. The assembly lines were stationary, the conveyor belts like long black tongues. A few workers were standing in small groups near the loading docks, their voices low and urgent. They saw me, and for the first time, I didn't see pity or mockery in their eyes. I saw a grim, hard-won respect. They knew what had happened at the gala. They knew who had opened the books. I walked toward the side exit, the one that led to the vendor receiving area. This was the place where it had all started, the place where I first noticed the discrepancies in the shipping weights and the phantom invoices for raw materials that never arrived. It was also where I had planned the final confrontation. Victor was there. He was leaning against a stack of empty pallets, his clothes the same ones he had worn the night before, now stained and rumpled. He was holding a small silver flask, but his hands were shaking so violently that he couldn't bring it to his lips. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside, a husk left behind after the fire had burned through. He looked up as I approached. There was no rage left in him, only a dull, flat confusion. "They're coming for me, aren't they?" he asked, his voice a dry rasp. "They're already here, Victor," I said, gesturing toward the front of the building. "They're just finishing the paperwork upstairs." He looked at the empty warehouse, the vast echoing space that he had once treated as his personal kingdom. "I thought I was smarter than all of you. I thought the rules were for people who didn't have the courage to take what they wanted." "The rules aren't about courage," I said. "They're about physics. You can only remove so much from a structure before the weight of what's left becomes too much for the frame to bear. You weren't smarter, Victor. You were just louder, and eventually the noise stops." I walked closer to him, stopping just a few feet away. I wanted him to see me clearly. I wanted him to see the man he had called a bean counter, the man he had tried to turn into a sacrificial lamb. "I'm leaving now," I said. "I've taken a position with the regulatory board. I'll be the one reviewing the filings for your case. I'll be the one who ensures that every single cent you moved into those accounts is tracked back to its source. You won't be able to hide a single dollar." Victor let out a short, jagged laugh. "You're going to spend the rest of your life looking at my spreadsheets? That's your reward? You're still just a clerk, Andrew." "Maybe," I said, a small, cold smile touching my lips. "But I'm the clerk who owns your history, and in the end, that's the only thing that matters." I turned and walked toward the heavy steel door. I didn't look back at him. I didn't need to hear his voice again. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the blinding white light of the afternoon. The snow was still falling, but the wind had faded. I walked across the lot, my footsteps heavy and sure. I reached my car and sat inside, but I didn't start the engine. I watched the front entrance of the building. 10 minutes later, the doors opened. 2 agents led Victor out. He didn't struggle. He didn't shout. He walked with his head down, his shoulders slumped, his wrists hidden under the sleeves of his ruined jacket. They placed him in the back of one of the black SUVs and drove away, the tires carving deep ruts in the fresh snow. I watched the vehicle disappear around the corner. The closure was complete. The logistics of the revenge had been executed with a 100% success rate. There was no aftermath to manage, no reflection to be had. The ledger was balanced. I reached out and turned the key. The engine hummed to life, a steady mechanical purr that signaled the start of a new shift. I put the car in gear and pulled out of the lot, heading toward the highway. I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. The Miller Procurement building was a receding shape in the gray mist, a monument to a collapsed era. I didn't feel a sense of loss. I didn't feel a sense of triumph. I felt the quiet, clinical satisfaction of a job well done. I was no longer the man who approved the contracts. I was the man who decided when they were over. I drove into the white, the road ahead clear and empty. I chose this. I finished this.